We shook hands on camera every single night for 30 years. Smiled. Laughed. Sold the world of friendship. But when the lights went dark, I saw who they really were. Tonight, I opened my private notebook, the one I swore I'd burn. 7 names. 7 legends. Worshipped by millions, feared by everyone who ever worked beside them. This is not the story you saw on television. This is what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Pour yourself a drink. Some of these names, you already love. By the end, you won't look at them the same way again. For decades he was America's dad. A gentle father figure in colorful sweaters, dispensing warm advice to millions of families every week. His show topped the ratings for years and shaped how an entire generation saw what a good man looked like on television. But behind that image was a different story, one that took decades to fully surface. In 2005, a Temple University employee named Andrea Constand told police that Cosby had drugged and assaulted her at his home a year earlier. She filed a civil suit. During that case, 13 other women came forward, willing to testify that Cosby had done the same to them. The case was settled quietly. No charges were filed. The story faded. Then in 2014, everything changed. A stand-up comedian publicly called Cosby a rapist during his own routine, and the clip spread. Within weeks, dozens of women began telling their stories publicly for the first time. Some spoke to reporters. Some wrote op-eds. One by one, the accounts lined up with disturbing consistency. Meet privately. Offered a drink or a pill. Waking up disoriented, with no memory of what happened next. By the end of that year, more than 20 women had come forward. Eventually the number passed 50, spanning incidents dating back to the 1960s. In 2015, prosecutors in Pennsylvania finally filed criminal charges in the Constand case, just weeks before the statute of limitations would have expired. The first trial ended in a deadlocked jury. A second trial followed in 2018. This time, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty on 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. Bill Cosby, once the most trusted father figure in America, was sentenced to prison. In 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned that conviction, not because it found him innocent, but because of a procedural agreement made years earlier by a previous prosecutor. Cosby walked free. The overturning was about legal process, not about what the dozens of women had described. The image of America's dad never fully recovered. Reruns were pulled. Honors were rescinded. A man once seen as a moral compass for the country became, for millions, the clearest example of how far a public image can drift from private reality. The lesson people took from it wasn't really about one man. It was about how long a carefully built reputation can shield someone from consequences, and what it finally takes to break that shield. On screen, he was granted. A face that never flinched, a stare that could end an argument before it started. Charles Bronson built an entire career on being the toughest, quietest man in the room. Audiences loved him for exactly that. Off-screen, that same silence hid something far more volatile. Director Michael Winner, who worked with Bronson on multiple films, later described him plainly, a reputation for blowing up and hitting people on set. Not occasional tension. A pattern serious enough that people who worked with him talked about it for decades afterward. Bronson also made no effort to hide his contempt for the new generation of actors rising around him. He dismissed Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Sylvester Stallone in blunt terms, calling them, in his own words, full of it. Men who would go on to be considered among the greatest actors of their era, waved off by a co-star who saw himself as the only real thing in the room. On the set of Hard Times, tensions boiled over when director Walter Hill criticized the acting of Bronson's wife, Jill Ireland. Bronson never confronted him loudly. He simply refused to shake Hill's hand afterward, and never worked with him again. No explanation. No second chance. Just silence, and a door closed forever. Interviewers who sat across from him described the same experience over and over. He wouldn't elaborate. Wouldn't volunteer a single unnecessary word. One journalist who spent days trying to get him talking wrote that Bronson seemed to view himself less like an artist and more like, in his own comparison, a bar of soap, a product to be sold. Cooperation felt optional to him, even when it was his job. For years, Bronson also told reporters dramatic stories about his past. Street fights. Arrests for assault. A skill with knives that made him sound dangerous even off camera. Reporters ran with it, because it fit the image perfectly. Later research into his life found that many of those stories didn't hold up. No arrest record matched the fights he described. The tough guy backstory that fans assumed was real turned out to be, at least partly, a character Bronson built for himself off-screen as carefully as the ones he played on it. That's the detail people find most unsettling. Not that Bronson was difficult. Plenty of stars were. It's that even his honesty was a performance, curated the same way his silence was, right down to which stories he let slip and which door he simply refused to shake hands through. The voice was pure velvet. Old Blue Eyes, the man who made an entire generation fall in love one note at a time. Frank Sinatra was elegance itself on stage. But the FBI kept a file on him for over 40 years, and it wasn't because of his singing. In February 1947, a photograph surfaced from a hotel in Havana, Cuba. It showed Sinatra seated with Lucky Luciano and other major organized crime figures at what turned out to be a mob summit. Sinatra denied everything, calling the reports vicious lies, claiming he'd simply run into people. But the FBI's file, spanning 4 decades, listed him as a contact connected to Sam Giancana, Carlo Gambino, and other names straight out of organized crime's upper ranks. He was never charged. There was never enough proof. But the suspicion never fully left him either. His temper matched the intensity of the rumors. Sinatra himself blamed what he called his Sicilian temper for his outbursts, and those close to him described a genuine Jekyll and Hyde quality beneath the charm. During one live performance, he accused his drummer of missing a cue and hurled a glass pitcher directly at his head. The drummer ducked just in time. When John F. Kennedy's team learned about Sinatra's mob associations, the Secret Service quietly canceled a planned presidential stay at Sinatra's own Palm Springs estate, a house Sinatra had spent a fortune preparing, helipad included. Sinatra didn't take the news quietly. He reportedly tore the place apart in fury, smashing doors and ripping up floors he had built specifically to host the man he'd helped elect. Journalists who suggested a mob connection learned quickly what that fury looked like in print form too. Sinatra sued reporters, lashed out publicly, and once described the press covering these stories as, in his words, pimps and whores. It wasn't a metaphor he used lightly, and it wasn't the language of a man who felt he had nothing to hide. What makes Sinatra's story different from a simple bad temper anecdote is the scale of it. This wasn't one bad night. It was a lifetime of proximity to organized crime, carefully managed denials, and a public image so tightly controlled that even federal investigators couldn't fully separate the myth from the man. The voice never stopped being beautiful. But underneath it, for over 40 years, there was a file the government never closed. He was the first breakout star of Saturday Night Live. Cool, sarcastic, effortlessly funny, the guy who made falling down look like the smartest joke in the room. Chevy Chase left the show after just one season to become a movie star, and for a while, it worked. But almost everywhere Chase went afterward, conflict followed close behind. When he returned to SNL in 1978 to host, tension with the cast had already been building since he left. Backstage, he started giving orders and tried to reclaim segments from cast members who had taken over in his absence. Bill Murray eventually told him plainly that the cast couldn't stand him. The two came to blows before the show even aired that night. Directors who worked with him told similar stories for decades. On National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, director Chris Columbus stepped down from the project, later saying Chase had treated him with open contempt. On Memoirs of an Invisible Man, director John Carpenter described directing Chase as the stuff of nightmares, saying he was nearly impossible to work with on set. The most serious incident came decades later, on the set of Community. During a dispute with creator Dan Harmon over his character's direction, Chase used a racial slur during filming. He hadn't directed it at a specific person, but the moment detonated the set. Harmon later said Chase had repeatedly interrupted co-star Donald Glover's scenes and made race-based remarks between takes, at one point telling Glover people only found him funnier because he was black. Chase was fired from the show shortly after. What makes Chase's story stand out isn't a single blow-up. It's the pattern, stretching from his first year on television all the way through his 60s, of leaving frustrated directors and hurt co-stars behind on nearly every project he touched. And when reporters eventually asked him, decades later, how it felt hearing former colleagues call him a jerk, Chase didn't deny it and didn't apologize. He simply said he didn't care what anyone thought of him. Which, to the people who'd worked with him, sounded exactly like the same man they remembered. They called him Mr. Television. In 1948, Milton Berle's Texaco Star Theater was so popular that television set sales doubled almost overnight. He was the first true star of the medium, the reason millions of American families bought their first TV. But among fellow comedians, Berle carried a second nickname that told a very different story, the thief of bad gags. The reputation followed him for over 60 years, and it wasn't a rumor. Berle himself admitted it, telling the New York Times plainly that if he heard a joke he thought would work, he used it. No shame, no denial, just a shrug. Bob Hope, one of the biggest comedians of the era, said he loved sitting home watching Berle on television just to see how his own jokes were doing. Jack Benny put it even more bluntly, joking that when you took a joke away from Milton Berle, it wasn't stealing, it was repossessing. Even fellow comic Henny Youngman turned it into a running gag, once telling a colleague not to worry about wishing he'd said a joke first, because eventually Berle would say it for him. Berle never fully denied it. He offered his own explanation instead, claiming that in the old vaudeville world, borrowing material was just how things worked, as long as you added something and made it your own. But those closest to him painted a different picture. One associate who knew him personally said Berle's insistence that he'd stopped stealing once he became successful simply wasn't something any of his friends or peers actually believed. There was a pattern behind the jokes too. Berle had a habit of inserting himself into other performers' acts during live shows, extending his own stage time by writing alongside someone else's material. He defended it as generosity, claiming he was giving other performers more time in the spotlight next to the biggest star of the night. Critics saw it differently, a man with an enormous hunger for attention, dressed up as a favor. What makes Berle's story different from most is that he never really tried to hide it. He leaned into the reputation, joked about it publicly, and kept working steadily until he was 91 years old. In an industry built on originality, Milton Berle became legendary partly for refusing to pretend he had any. Mustache, grin, motorcycle jacket. Burt Reynolds was the biggest box office star in the world for 5 straight years running, the definition of easygoing masculine charm on screen. Off-screen, the people closest to him described someone very different. His 5-year relationship with Sally Field began on the set of Smokey and the Bandit in 1977. In her memoir, In Pieces, Field described the relationship in her own words as controlling and emotionally abusive. She wrote that Reynolds was intensely possessive, recalling how if she ran into a man she'd once known, he would grab her face in his hands and demand to know exactly who the man was and what history they shared. The control extended into her career. As Field's star rose with her Oscar-nominated role in Norma Ray, Reynolds grew visibly uncomfortable. When the 1980 Academy Awards approached, Field said he refused to attend as her date. According to Field, his exact words to her were a dismissive question about whether she even thought she'd win anything. She ended up attending with another couple instead, borrowing their company for what should have been her own moment. The same pattern followed her to the Cannes Film Festival, where Field said Reynolds again declined to support her publicly. Looking back decades later, Field connected the dynamic to something deeper, telling interviewers that Reynolds' volatility echoed feelings she'd experienced growing up around her stepfather, a comparison she described as both painful and clarifying. Reynolds' insecurity showed up in smaller, stranger ways too. His toupee became an open secret in Hollywood, one he mostly joked about publicly. But underneath the humor was a man who wore it in nearly every film he made for decades, unwilling to be seen without it even as he laughed the topic off in interviews. What makes Reynolds' story land differently than a simple ego story is the source. This isn't secondhand gossip. It's Sally Field, one of the most respected actresses of her generation, describing in her own memoir what it actually felt like to build a life next to Hollywood's most beloved leading man, and finding fear where the audience only ever saw charm. For half a century, Jerry Lewis was known as the king of comedy, a man who could turn a stumble or a strange face into a belly laugh for millions. Every Labor Day, he hosted a telethon that raised tens of millions of dollars for muscular dystrophy research, earning him the image of a tireless humanitarian. But many of the people he was raising money for told a very different story. A group calling themselves Jerry's Orphans, made up of former telethon poster children, began publicly protesting his approach by the early 1990s. Their complaint was that Lewis's language, constantly calling disabled adults as kids, and framing the telethon around pity rather than dignity, kept an entire community frozen in a childlike, tragic image for television audiences. Lewis didn't respond with reflection. In a nationally broadcast interview, when asked about people who didn't want to be pitied, he told them bluntly to stay in their houses. One protester, a man with muscular dystrophy since childhood, said Lewis reacted to any criticism from the disability community with pure fury. His temper showed up elsewhere too. During the 18th hour of his 2007 telethon, Lewis used an anti-gay slur live on air while riffing with the crew. He apologized publicly the next day. Then, in 2014, he used the exact same slur again, this time to an Australian reporter who'd simply asked him about cricket. His feuds extended to fellow entertainers as well. After comedian Joan Rivers criticized him for discussing a dying child's condition on live television, Lewis didn't just disagree. He told a radio audience that Rivers had, in his words, set the Jewish people back 1,000 years, over a comment about telethon etiquette. By 2011, Lewis parted ways with the charity he'd fronted for nearly 6 decades, under circumstances the organization never fully explained. He said publicly he was still at a loss to understand why. What makes Lewis's story land differently is the gap between the mission and the man. This wasn't a star behaving badly on a film set. It was decades of built-up goodwill, funded by real donations from real families, run by someone the very community he claimed to serve said made them feel smaller every single year.